You've had the same job title for 11 years, senior systems analyst. Nobody at a party has ever asked a single follow-up question about what that means, including, on at least one occasion, your own mother. You work for a mid-sized insurance company that processes claims for commercial trucking fleets. This is, if you're being honest, one of the least interesting sentences a human being can say out loud. You've watched people's eyes glaze over in real time, mid-sentence, like you just started reading them the ingredients on a cereal box. Someone at a wedding once asked what you do, and by the time you finished the second clause of your answer, they had already turned slightly toward the bar, physically angling their body away from the conversation like a plant leaning towards sunlight, except the sunlight was an open bar, and you were the shade. You do not resent this. You clocked out of caring about this reaction sometime around year 4, when you stopped narrating your job at parties altogether and just said, "I work in insurance," which ends the conversation roughly 9 seconds faster. Here's the part nobody clocks, including, for a long time, you. The job that makes people's eyes glaze over is also the job that made you a millionaire, not millionaire in the aspirational, someday manifestation journal sense. Millionaire in the actual sitting in front of you on a screen sense. $1,140,000, to be annoyingly specific, spread across a 401k, a brokerage account, and a modest amount of home equity that you try not to count because counting home equity before you sell the house feels like counting calories you haven't eaten yet. Let's go back to year 1, because year 1 is important, mostly as a lesson in how unimpressive beginnings are allowed to be. You started at $52,000 a year. Your studio apartment had a window that looked directly into the studio apartment across the alley, close enough that you and your neighbor developed an unspoken agreement to never, under any circumstances, make eye contact while doing dishes. HR handed you a packet on day 1 that included, among other things, a 1-page flyer about the company's 401k match. You skimmed it the way you skim terms and conditions, which is to say you scrolled past it with your eyes technically open. The flyer said the company matched 4% of your contribution. You had at the time approximately zero understanding of what a 401k match actually was, functionally. You understood it the way you understand jury duty, a thing that exists, that applies to you, that you will deal with eventually, probably badly. You contributed 3% that first year, mostly because the enrollment form defaulted to 3% and changing it felt like more effort than it was worth for a paycheck you were already mentally spending on rent, groceries, and a truly ill-advised amount of takeout Thai food. This is, in retrospect, the first of several accidental good decisions in this story, and I want to be very clear that accidental is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Your coworker Steve, 3 cubicles down, did not contribute at all that first year. Steve had opinions about this. Steve had opinions about most things, actually, delivered at a volume that suggested he assumed everyone within 40 feet found him as fascinating as he found himself. "I need that money now," Steve told you, unprompted, while you were both waiting for the same printer to finish jamming on the same stack of claims forms. "Retirement is like 40 years away. I'm not tying up my cash for 40 years. He said, tying up my cash the way people say things they heard on a podcast once and have since fully adopted as personal philosophy. Steve, for the record, was also driving a leased BMW at the time, on a $54,000 salary, which is a sentence that contains its own complete rebuttal if you just sit with it for a second. You didn't argue with Steve. You've never argued with Steve in 11 years about anything, mostly because arguing with Steve requires energy you'd rather spend on literally any other activity, including reformatting spreadsheets, which you also don't particularly enjoy. By year 3, you'd bumped your contribution to 6%, again mostly by accident. HR sent an email about auto-escalation enrollment, a feature that increases your contribution by 1% every year unless you opt out, and you did not opt out, because opting out required logging into a portal you didn't have the password for memorized. And frankly, some of the best financial decisions of your adult life have been made purely out of not wanting to deal with a password reset. This is, weirdly, the actual thesis of this video, if a story like this is allowed to have a thesis. You didn't get rich by being disciplined. You got rich by being slightly too lazy to undo the default settings. Your 401k balance at the end of year 3, $11,400. Underwhelming. You checked it once, felt nothing in particular, and went back to microwaving a burrito. Year 5, you got promoted. Not dramatically, No confetti, no corner office, just a title change from systems analyst to senior systems analyst, a $6,000 raise, and a slightly better parking spot that you have used exactly 11 times because it requires walking past the loading dock, and the loading dock smells, for reasons nobody has ever fully explained to you, permanently like burnt coffee and cardboard. Steve did not get promoted that year. Steve's takeaway from this was not, maybe I should reconsider my approach, but rather an extended, unsolicited monologue about how the company doesn't reward talent, only tenure, delivered to you over the printer again, because apparently the printer is where all of Steve's philosophical revelations occur. You bumped your contribution to 8% with the raise because 2% of a bigger number still felt roughly the same coming out of your paycheck, a phenomenon personal finance people apparently call lifestyle creep avoidance, and you call not noticing. Your balance at the end of year 5, $34,000. You remember this number specifically because it was, for the first time, larger than the amount you owed on your car loan, which felt like a small, private, entirely uncelebrated victory. You did not post about it. Nobody would have cared. You barely cared honestly, beyond a brief mental note that filed itself somewhere between interesting and irrelevant. Here's where the story stops being about discipline and starts being about math doing something math does that nobody adequately warns you about. By year 7, your contributions were still modest. You were putting in maybe $400 a month between your own contribution and the match. Reasonable. Unremarkable. The kind of number that wouldn't make anyone's jaw drop at a dinner party, assuming anyone at a dinner party wanted to talk about your 401k contributions, which, again, they emphatically do not. But the account had started doing something on its own. The market had a genuinely excellent 7-year run, the kind that gets called a bull market by people on financial news channels who say the word bull with a specific, aggressive enthusiasm that always makes you a little uncomfortable, like they're personally responsible for it. Your balance at the end of year 7, $89,000. You didn't put in $89,000. You put in, cumulatively, something closer to $38,000. The other $51,000 just showed up, the way a party guest shows up that nobody invited but everyone's too polite to ask about. Steve, meanwhile, had started a side business, selling protein powder through a multi-level marketing structure that he described with total sincerity as basically like having equity in a company, which is a sentence that has never once been true in the history of protein powder. Let's talk about the years you didn't do anything, because those years are, embarrassingly, the ones doing most of the work here. Year 9. The market dropped 19% over about 4 months. This is the year everyone remembers, the year your uncle sent a group text that just said, "Sell everything" in all caps. No punctuation, no context. Like a man signaling a fire from a lighthouse. Your uncle did, in fact, sell everything. Your uncle also, several months later, bought back in at a higher price than he sold at, a maneuver so reliably common among panicked investors that finance people have a name for it, and the name is not flattering, and I will not be saying it here because your uncle might watch this video, and you love him, even though he's wrong about basically everything related to money. You didn't sell anything, mostly because selling required logging into an account you'd half forgotten the password to, on a phone with 4% battery, while also trying to make dinner, and by the time you found the energy to deal with any of it, the market had already started recovering, and the emotional urgency had evaporated into the specific fog of, "I'll deal with this later," that governs most of adult life. This turned out to be, again, an accidental correct decision, made through inertia rather than conviction, which, and I want to stress this, is not a strategy anyone should feel proud of, except that it apparently works, repeatedly, suspiciously well, in a way that feels almost unfair to people who actually try hard at investing. By year 10, your balance crossed $180,000. Steve's protein powder business had, by this point, quietly folded, a fact you only learned because he stopped bringing sample shaker bottles to the office, and also because he mentioned it once, briefly, in a tone that suggested the topic was now permanently closed, the way people talk about ex-relationships they'd rather not revisit. You got another modest raise. You bumped your contribution again, this time to 10%. Not because you had a financial epiphany, but because a coworker in HR, during an unrelated conversation about expense reports, mentioned offhandedly that most people should be contributing at least 10% if they can. And you thought, fine, sure. 10%, and changed it that afternoon in about 90 seconds, which is objectively less time than you spend most days deciding what to have for lunch. Here's the part where the numbers start getting genuinely, almost insultingly easy. By year 11, this year, present day, the year you're technically narrating this from, your combined accounts crossed $1,140,000. Your salary, for context, is now $94,000. You are not, by any conventional measure, a high earner. You do not have a dramatic story. You did not discover an underrated stock. You did not time the market. You did not start a business, invent an app, or inherit anything from a wealthy relative, unless you count the $600 your grandmother left you in 2019, which you put into the same account, where it has since quietly tripled, doing considerably more with itself than it ever did sitting in her sock drawer, which is, apparently, where she kept it. The account crossed 7 figures on a Tuesday. You know this because you happened to check it during a meeting about claims processing software, a meeting so aggressively uninteresting that checking your phone under the table felt less like a distraction and more like basic self-preservation. You saw the number. You felt something. Not euphoria, exactly. More like the specific, quiet satisfaction of solving a crossword clue you'd been stuck on for a while. You put your phone away. Someone was presenting a slide about workflow optimization. You nodded along, the way you've nodded along in approximately 400 meetings over 11 years, none of which you could describe in detail if your life depended on it. Steve, for what it's worth, is still at the company, different cubicle now, closer to the window, which he mentions with a specific pride that suggests he considers it a promotion, even though it isn't one officially or unofficially. Steve still contributes the company minimum to his 401k, still talks about needing the cash now, still has, as far as you can tell, no idea what compound interest actually does over a decade, despite having had 11 years of front row access to a live demonstration standing 3 cubicles away from him the entire time. You don't bring any of this up with Steve, partly because it would be unkind, mostly because Steve would somehow turn it into a story about himself, the way Steve turns literally everything into a story about himself, including, once, memorably, a story about a fire drill. Here's the genuinely funny part, if you allow yourself to find any of this funny, which you mostly do, at this point, in a quiet, internal way that nobody else witnesses. You did not get rich by being smart about money. You got rich by being a specific, particular flavor of unbothered, too busy, too tired, too mildly disorganized to undo a series of small, automatic decisions that quietly compounded into a number that would have seemed absurd to the version of you filling out that first enrollment form 11 years ago. Defaulting to 3% because changing it felt like too much effort. The job is still boring. It has never once, in 11 years, stopped being boring. You still process claims for commercial trucking fleets. You still sit through meetings about workflow optimization. You still say, "I work in insurance" at parties and watch people's eyes drift toward the bar. Nothing about the actual day-to-day texture of your life has changed in any way that would make an interesting movie, or even an interesting 15-minute YouTube video, honestly, which is a slightly uncomfortable thing to admit while making one. But somewhere underneath all of that boredom, doing absolutely nothing dramatic, a number has been quietly growing for 11 years, at a pace that had nothing to do with how exciting your job was, and everything to do with the fact that you showed up, contributed a percentage you barely thought about, and then got out of your own way long enough for compound interest to do what compound interest apparently does best when nobody's watching too closely. You didn't beat the system, you just didn't fight it. Which, it turns out, might be the least cinematic plot twist in the history of plot twists. And also, somehow, the only one that actually works.